What if we could include a woman of color and think about how she was here when America was born? Now, her story began out on Long Island in the 1760s. I estimate that she was born around 1763 in a town called Oyster Bay, New York. So Liss didn't come from Africa. She was born in America. She's a New Yorker at birth, but she was also enslaved at birth. Come on in, folks, it's okay. Come on in. Yep, you can get settled. I just got started, so it's all good. Now here's her name in writing. Not in Liss's handwriting, but in the writing of people who enslaved her. And so the first word is her nickname, Liss. Now, you guys are into history, so raise your hand if you know what a long S is. Aha, yes. So it really is L-I-S-S. In this time period, in cursive and in print, an S that appeared in the middle of a word looked a whole lot like an F, but it was pronounced like an S. It's just their way of expressing it. And there you see her full given name, Elizabeth. She had a mother named Pender. I only discovered her mother in the last few years. And such an unusual name, Pender. It's a real gift to a historian. I haven't found another record of Pender, but with such an unusual name, it gives me hope that if I did find a Pender, it might be her. And she also had a little sister, Hannah, who was about 2 years younger than Liss. So, Liss, Hannah, Pender, somebody tell me, what don't they have?
Last names.
Last names. And that was typical of people who were enslaved at that time. Now, her father, unfortunately, I don't even have a first name for. And I don't know whether they were close and she knew him her whole life, or if they were separated from each other and she really didn't know him at all. And not knowing about her father is also because of culture and law. Because enslaved people were owned at birth through their mother's enslavement. If you were an enslaved woman and you had a baby, the moment that child was born, whoever enslaved you now owned your child until death for their entire life, unless something happened that allowed them to become free, right? The same person's father, their enslaver did not own that child at all. And so they were never part of the record. So if you do find a record of a father or paternity, you need to really value that record and understand how special it is, because there aren't many of them. Now, because Liss didn't have a last name, a lot of people say to me, who is alive today who's related to Liss? Well, of course, there are people alive today who are related to Liss, but we can't find them, we can't connect them, because our genealogical records are all organized by last names. But I'll keep working on it, right? And so Liss, to make it even more complicated, come on in, folks. It's fine, we only just got started. Liss wasn't enslaved by just one household. She was actually co-enslaved by two brothers, separate households. And both of their houses are still standing today. The first is the house of Samuel Townsend of Oyster Bay. That's the household we'll really focus on today, because that's where most of her records come from. But his brother, Dr. James Townsend, in the next town over, Jericho, his house is also still standing, and he owned half of Liss and half of her sister. And so it's hard enough for us to understand that people were owning other people. But now I want you to even go deeper and understand that through inheritance, one enslaved black person, because they were so valuable, would be split amongst heirs. So Liss and Hannah were split 50-50 between two brothers, but I found other records in the same family and in other families of one person being split 3 ways, 4 ways, as many as 7 ways, a woman named Sarah. And in Sarah's record, the great-grandfather of Samuel said, They are to be divided as the stock of swine and cattle are, in the same manner and proportion. Now let's just talk about slavery in the North, because it's often a Southern institution located in the time of the Civil War and talking about the Underground Railroad. That's what we were taught in school. That's where the slavery section was located. But we need to go back now in time, back in New York, all the way back. What was New York called before it was called New York? New Amsterdam. The Dutch brought enslaved black people here the very first year they organized themselves, right? In 1626. And then when the British took over, they really took the institution of slavery and made it much worse. The British instituted chattel slavery, which was this idea that a child, when they were born, was owned by the mother's owner and enslaved for life. That was a British thing. And so here's our 13 colonies in 1770, with a red bar separating the North from the South that we think about today. In the North, New York had more slavery than any other northern colony. Not by a little, by a lot. New York had more slavery than all of New England's colonies combined, and more than Georgia in 1770. The two big cities of slavery in 1770 were Charleston and New York City. So we really have to change our thinking about slavery in New York. Now, misconceptions about slavery in the North have been put into our minds in such a way that this was a textbook that wasn't pulled off the shelves for fourth graders until 2016. This textbook told children some people owned 1 or 2 slaves. This idea that northern enslavers, 1 or 2, as if that would make it better. But they were families. Families start with a mother and father, and then all their children. The idea of 1 or 2 just doesn't work. The math is wrong. And then also that they were cared for like family members. Certainly not. Certainly not cared for like family members. And so we really must never say these untrue things. This was a homework assignment that a parent sent me this year. And it seems very innocent at first. We're teaching students about colonial jobs. Good, they need to know about that, right? They need to know about shipbuilders, blacksmiths, woodworkers. But what's missing from this explanation, which says colonists had to work very hard because everything had to be done and made themselves. Wait a minute. Who's doing the hard work?
Sleep.
Right. They're not mentioned on the worksheet anywhere. They're left out of the story. You cannot do that and misinform our young children about how America was built. Now, New York instituted a law in 1730 that really demonstrates what the lives were like of enslaved people. In that 1730 New York law, every town, including this one and all the other ones, had to have a town-appointed, town-paid slave whipper. Every town had a whipping post, especially for enslaved black people, and a person who was paid under the law 3 shillings per whipping. Okay? I figured out who the slave whippers of Oyster Bay were. You could probably figure out who the slave whippers of Goshen were if you looked back in the record. Because a lot of these records exist, they're just not being read. In fact, just to go back, Oyster Bay had a paid appointed slave whipper of the town in 1714, before that law was put into place. This is a record I found much later, 1802, from a blacksmith in Oyster Bay, who is being paid to put a band and a bolt on a black, with 3 wearing irons and 1 ring, which is going to attach to something else, collaring and shackling. It makes sense that the blacksmith would do that, right? But that means as historians, we have to look in those blacksmith records and read them very carefully. There are also tons of runaway slave ads. These are ads put in the paper offering rewards for people who are trying to free themselves, to self-emancipate by escaping. Now, if we go back to the map and think, all 13 colonies had legal slavery. Where are they running to? Any ideas?
Canada.
Nope. Canada had legal slavery until the 1790s. Where else could they be going?
Out west.
You could go into the wilderness. You could live in a place that was completely wild. But you, of course, had been born and raised in a place that was civilized. That would be tough, but I expect people did try to do it. There was one group who would take you in for life. Who do you think that was? They enslaved people too. Who would do that?
The Indians.
Yes, native people, who themselves were being enslaved as well by the colonists. That is why if you go to the Shinnecock tribes out on the east end of Long Island, many of the members of the tribe have African American features because they allowed formerly enslaved black people to live in their community. Now this is a runaway ad I have for you to look at and think about because it's from Oyster Bay where Liss was. And like all of them, there's so many neat details. This is a man named Isaac. It says that he's been in Oyster Bay about a year, passing himself as free. He declares himself a free man and gives himself a last name, Isaac Johnston. His enslaver who's trying to recapture him doesn't give him that last name. Says his name is Isaac. He calls himself Isaac Johnston. And it describes all of his clothing very carefully. It says he's very ragged. His coat is light and patched with different colors, a worsted vest and linen trousers. Why do you think they're describing his clothes so carefully? He only has one set of clothes. And this set of clothes that he was given by his enslaver was already worn out. They weren't giving enslaved people new clothes. They were giving them worn out clothes that they had to patch with other pieces of fabric just to hold them together. It says he's pockmarked. What does that mean?
Smallpox.
Smallpox. He's survived the smallpox. He's got scars to prove it. They're just trying to give you ways of identifying him. And we don't know what happened to Isaac. It says he may be hiding in Cold Spring Harbor, which is one of the next towns over. Or maybe he got on a boat and he crossed Long Island Sound and he's in Norwalk, Connecticut. And here's one for your town that I found just yesterday and put in the slideshow. This is such an evocative story. Any one of you could pick up this story and start researching it. You could give a talk here next year about this man, whose name was Joe or Cudjoe. If you email me, I'll give you access to this in a file. It says, right away last night, he's named Joe, or as he was formerly called, Cudjoe, and he's been, for almost 2 years, the ferryman at a rope ferry, a Little Ferry, below Hackensack. So the next time you go to Little Ferry, think about Joe. This was a ferry that you pull a rope to get across on, right? So he was enslaved down there, and that was his job. And again, it describes what he was wearing, his coat of dark London brown, his red cape and cuffs. And then it says, "'Tis supposed he's gone to Goshen in Orange County, from whence he came." He's not expecting to be free. He's expecting to see his loved ones. He says he came from there about 3 or 4 years ago. Then it describes him as being a man of great cunning. Translated, he's smart. He's very smart. He may forge a very plausible story on the road, as he is much addicted to lying. He's smart, right? He was brought up almost from his infancy by a certain Isaac Nichols, that's who enslaved him here, who now lives in New Jersey, but who during the war kept a tavern in the town of Goshen. So you're being given a lot of details to figure out Joe's story. Where was the tavern in your town? Who owned it? Was it Isaac Nichols? So I'm getting sidetracked because I was excited to share this with you, but I think that somebody should look into this. This is 1787, and tell the story of Joe here in your town so people will remember him. Now, you could also find a lot of ads in the paper selling enslaved people. They were valuable property, and they were listed in the paper just like a car would be listed. The top one is saying, a few healthy young Negro slaves to be sold very cheap by Jacob Townsend Jr. I told you about Samuel Townsend and his brother, Dr. James. This is their other brother, who lives right next to Samuel in Oyster Bay where Liss was. So Liss knew these people who were being sold away from their family. Once your family member was sold away, how are you ever going to know who bought them? How are you ever going to contact them again? The likelihood is that enslaved people couldn't read or write. They weren't given an education. So these young people are being sold very cheap because essentially they were free to Jacob. They were born to a woman that he enslaved, and when they would grow up to be 11, 12, 13 years old, that was old enough to be sold off for profit. He's doing that in the city, New York City, where he has a shop, but they were probably raised out on his property on Long Island. And then down at the bottom, a strong, healthy Negro wench is being sold. I just wanted to get your ear hearing that word wench. It's not a word I knew about till I started doing this research, but in this era, it exclusively meant an attractive young enslaved black woman. So sometimes you're not looking for the word slave. That was common. Slavery was legal. Sometimes you're looking for other words. And for women, you're looking for that word wench. So the Townsend family that I've been talking about that enslaved Liss was a big, wealthy family. This isn't them. They didn't have their portrait taken, but it's like them. And they were a big family. Samuel Townsend's wife was Sarah, and then they had 8 children who survived childhood. I've bumped up the font of Robert, because he's the one that we're really going to talk about today. Although I'm going to mention one other of their kids here. Samuel Townsend was a wealthy shipping merchant, and he had built in Oyster Bay a fleet of sailing vessels, most of them named after his family members. So Audrey had got a brig named after her. That's his daughter Audrey. His oldest son Solomon had a sloop he named the sloop Solomon. His wife had the brig Sarah named after her, because if you forget to name one after your wife, you get in big trouble for that. And then his daughter Sally got one named after her. And they were sailing all over the world. They weren't bringing enslaved black people back as a product. They were bringing back household goods and foodstuffs. But boy, did they get all around the world. They did have a close relative who was operating a fleet of slave ships, and that was the mom Sarah's brother. He wasn't from Long Island, he was from Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island. When you go to Newport, you take the big tour of the fancy houses. The fancy houses' money came from the slave trade. Newport was huge in the slave trade. And so Captain Robert Stoddard Sr., that nice-looking guy, he would take voyages all the way to the coast of Africa with his ships. And for a whole year, they would capture people. And they weren't bringing them back to Rhode Island. So they leave from Rhode Island, they go to Africa, but where do they end up, the enslaved people? Can you see it in the ad? It's a little blurry. Call it out if you see where they're going to. Antigua, right, the Caribbean. And there, they're being enslaved in the sugar business or making rum. So the Townsends of Long Island were buying sugar and rum from this in-law of theirs who was getting all that wealth from the slave trade. So the tribal trade was pretty apparent in this group. Now, I just want to mention, because we're here in Goshen, the oldest son, Solomon. This younger picture of him is during the 1770s, 1774, when he was captaining one of his father's ships, the brigantine Sarah, and he's looking quite handsome there. And then here's a picture of him older in life after the war, when he was a New York State legislator. He had a house in Chester where he lived. He also had a house in New York City. But he had an iron forge on the Ramapo River, and that was where he really made his money. So this is a fantastic map. For any historian that wants a copy of this, just email me. You see the Ramapo River, the road that used to go along it. Of course, there's no railroad along it yet. It's too early for that. But you see Tuxedo being mentioned. This whole region is now called Tuxedo. It was all Solomon Townsend's many thousands of acres. He was making iron the old-fashioned way, mining rocks out of the land. His forests, they would cut down to make charcoal to get a hot enough fire to smelt the iron, right? And then he, because he'd been a ship's captain, was making iron anchors for ships because he knew a lot of the ship's captains from his earlier times in his life. So I just think that's so neat. They mentioned Southfield. Do you see up here it says the road to Goshen? And they've drawn a little hand pointing you in that direction. I found that map in the archives at Freedom Hall, just slipped into another thing. I was like, what? Love that map. All right, so back to Liss's story. Robert is the child who we basically talk about because he has become famous in the modern era. He was the guy who became Culper Jr., the head of Washington's spy network in New York during the Revolutionary War. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of this group, the Culper Spy Ring. Okay, so a few people, but not everybody, so I'll make sure I explain it. He was a spy for George Washington in Manhattan during the war, but he didn't tell anybody. It was dishonorable to be a spy. You wouldn't want to admit that you had done that. And so we only learned that he was the spy through his handwriting. See which great handwriting he had? Here he's signing his name Robert Townsend, and then here he's signing his name Culper Jr. in a letter to Washington. It wasn't until the 1930s that a historian figured out that Robert was the spy. Now, at that museum that had been his house, they loved that spy story. That's what they wanted to talk about. That the son had been a spy, and that the father, Samuel, had been a patriot. He was a fairly political guy. That the British had stayed in their house during the war, quartering themselves there. And that the son, Robert, had been this, dashing spy for Washington. Raynham Hall Museum would have kept telling that story forever because people were super interested in it. But then, in 2005, the phone rang. Changed everything. An auction house in New York City, Swan Galleries, called to say a descendant of the Townsends had inherited something that had been a secret. And now they wanted to sell that secret object for a lot of money. It was a Bible. This Bible normally wouldn't have been worth much, only it had the names of enslaved people written by hand in the end papers. So it went for $10,000 plus fees. And now the museum had this record of all these other people who had lived in the house, black people who had been enslaved there. There was a lot of names. Jeffrey, Catherine, Lily, Susanna, Harry, Susan, Rachel, Violet, Hannah, a different Susanna, Mary Ann, Jane, and Gabriel. And not just their names, but how they were related to each other. Sons, daughters, husbands, wives, when they were born, and in 2 cases when they died, and in 1 case, how the person died. So there's just a huge amount of information on this page. Then a second page that talked about 4 more people, Nancy, Kate, Jim, and Josh. In the middle of the second page, it said very clearly, these were the slaves of Samuel Townsend of Oyster Bay, in case anybody tried to get away from that. And then at the bottom, a really tragic story about how Jane and Gabriel were given to their oldest son, Solomon, the one that lived around here, as his wedding present at the end of the war when he got married. They wanted to give their son something really great for his wedding, and it was Jane and Gabriel. The bride's side gave a clock that's still at the museum. But this gift became more valuable over time because Jane and Gabriel had 7 children. Now, when they bought that Bible, see how pretty I used to be? That's me 20 years ago. I asked the museum to allow me to create an exhibit about that Bible. And they did. They let me do that. And I found out even more people through research for the exhibit. John, William, Jacob, Priscilla, her son Amos, who took the last name Burling when he became free. Then 2 records of people that didn't have any name associated, but I could tell from the record they were different people. So I call them the unnamed child and the unnamed man. But in the midst of all that research, I also discovered Liss. And of course, that's not what she looked like, right? She didn't have her portrait painted. So I've had a modern artist create this image for me to use. But I invite you to get to know Liss, come up with your own idea of what she might have looked like. We have to create our own imagery where it is absent in the historical record. Turned out, after all that research, they enslaved twice as many people as the white family, 20 different individuals that I found a record of. You know, I only found Pender recently, so there could have been more. But it really fights back against that 1 or 2 notion. These people were wealthy, but they weren't the wealthiest people ever, and they owned 20 enslaved black people. It had to do with how much land they owned, too. They owned 350 acres of land, and were cultivating that land. So how do we do this? How do we change our ideas and our thoughts about the time of America's founding? When these images are missing, these narratives are missing, the names are missing, we have to use our imagination to repaint the picture of what America was in our own minds. Now, that story of American Revolution really kicked into high gear in 1775, right? That's kind of the year we're in right now, 2025. Next year we'll really dig in and celebrate. But, you know, Lexington and Concord happened in 75. And Samuel joined the New York Congress. We think about the Continental Congress in Philadelphia a lot, right? But each colony had a local Congress. And in New York, our Congress was concerned. They knew the British were going to attack. And they thought the attack was going to be Manhattan. And they were planning, how are we going to fight back? How are we going to stop the British from taking our city? Can you imagine? That was New York City in 1775. The tallest building was Trinity Church, which would burn to the ground in 76. So now, August 1776, we just went through this month, and I hope you were thinking about the Battle of Brooklyn, right? Or, as they called it then, the Battle of Long Island, because Brooklyn was part of Long Island, right? So, raise your hand if you think the Americans won the Battle of Long Island. Who won, the Americans or the British?
British.
Did the British? Yeah, you guys are too smart in the historical society. Little kids will be like, the Americans won! No. We didn't just lose a little, right? We lost a lot. We lost by a lot. And Washington and his army had to retreat, or they would have been captured, and the whole war would have been over. It would have been a 1-month war instead of a 7-year war. That's how close we came to just having tea at 3 o'clock, right? And so when that happened, all of Long Island was now behind enemy lines where Liss lived. All of Manhattan not only was behind enemy lines, but Manhattan became British headquarters in the colonies. And of course, Staten Island too. Gotta remember Staten Island. They get very upset if you don't remember. So now you had a choice. If you were a patriot, are you gonna escape? Go to Connecticut maybe? Or you know, another part of New York that wasn't behind enemy lines? Or are you just going to try to blend in and, you know, make do and just keep your feelings in check? Samuel Townsend decided to stay. He had these 5 ships, he had the 350 acres of land, the 20 enslaved black people, the big family. He didn't want to lose all that wealth, so he stayed. But immediately, British troops came into town. He got arrested immediately. Luckily, he had this wealthy in-law that bailed him out by bribing the British with all this cash. So he got to go home and stay in his house that looked like that. But his house became the place where British commanders would be billeted when they brought their regiment to the town. So now I just want to stop and ask another question. How big's a regiment? Let's play the high-low game. You say a number, I'll say higher or lower. Higher than 100, but I appreciate your guess.
200.
Higher than 200.
3.
Ding, ding, ding. 300. 300 to 350. So now 350 soldiers come to this little town. They didn't even have 350 houses. It's not like one soldier to a house. They ended up taking over all the churches, making them into barracks, but the commander got the nice house, and that was the Townsend's house. And so one after another, different commanders are cycling in as their regiments come to town. They usually come for the winter. Nobody wanted to fight in the winter, and then they leave in the spring. And so this would cycle over and over again in these regiments. But in 78, a regiment came to town that made a real difference in Liss's life. Did anybody watch the show Turn? Okay. Turn made a mess of this story. And so we're just going to have to correct him, you know? When we make the movie about Liss, we will do it correctly. A man named John Simcoe was a commander of a regiment of 350 soldiers called the Queen's Rangers. And when he came to Oyster Bay, not Setauket, that was another problem, he stayed at the Townsend's house. And here's what the parlor room looked like, where he would have held his daily officers' meetings. He came in the fall, he was going to stay over the winter, and leave in the spring of 79. Now, I don't know if you can see that his soldiers' uniforms aren't red. Can you see the color that they are? Green? Yeah.
Green.
Why would he want his soldiers to be wearing green instead of red? Camo, right? He was a good commander. He didn't want his guys to have a big red uniform on their front. He was an interesting guy. He was a good commander, and he also thought slavery was morally wrong. Now, he'd been raised in England where it was legal. Now he was in America where it was legal, but he thought it was morally wrong. And he acted on his beliefs. He didn't just keep them in the back of his mind. He actually wanted to raise a regiment, form a regiment of escaped American, formerly enslaved men, and lead them into battle against the Americans. But the British Army wouldn't let him. They gave him the Queen's Rangers instead. But after the war, it was Simcoe who ended slavery in Canada, as I mentioned, in the 1790s. So now this man who would later end slavery in Canada and who strongly believed slavery was wrong is living in the house where Liss is enslaved. What's going to happen next? Well, his buddy comes to stay. He had a friend named John Andre, who you will know from Turn, or maybe somebody knows John Andre in general. Raise your hand if you ever heard of him. Yeah, all right, excellent. He drew that picture of himself. He liked to draw. He and Simcoe were really good friends, and they had a letter writing and visiting and fighting in battle together kind of a relationship throughout the war. This is the room at Raynham Hall where they believe the two men billeted. And so Andre wasn't just a buddy or a British officer, he was actually the top spy on the British side, the British spy master. Our American spy master was a guy named Benjamin Talmadge, you might have heard of. So Talmadge is the American spy master, Andre's the British spy master. All spying operations go through these two guys. And now this guy is staying at the house of the folks whose son, Robert, is about to become Washington's lead Manhattan spy. Do you think Andre knew that the son was an American spy? No, he had no idea. Robert came to stay while Andre was there at his parents' house. He didn't know. He thought he was just this bon vivant, neat guy. His way of spying was interesting. He wasn't a cruel spy. He was a super friendly, partying spy. He would be very, very friendly to people, and he'd throw big events. And that was how he got into people. Now, Liss would have known both those men very well, because Simcoe and Andre were VIPs in the house where she was enslaved. So on top of all the other things she had to do all day long, she would have had to take special care of these two men. And one of the only things we know from writing about her personality is this. She was too fond of the British officers. Another letter describes her as too fond of company. She was social. She had charisma, probably beautiful. And at this time, she was about 17. So it's really neat to know that about her personality, right? And so now I just want to explain the Culper spy ring to folks that don't understand it. So remember, Long Island and Manhattan are behind enemy lines. You can't find out what they're doing, right? Of course, there's no TV, no spy satellites, no Snapchat or TikTok or anything like that. Can't text people and ask them what the British are up to. So Washington had a problem. You know, he needed to know what was going on in British headquarters in Manhattan. Who was the spy he initially sent over from Connecticut? Things didn't go too well for him. Nathan Hale, caught within 5 days and put to death by the British, death by hanging. So now what's he going to do? He wants to find patriots who already live behind enemy lines, who he can trust, and get them to observe things, write it down in letters, and somehow get it over to Connecticut, which was controlled by the Americans for him, right? And so there was a farmer named Abraham Woodhull out in Setauket. He was a relative of a fallen American general, General Nathaniel Woodhull. He would get on his horse and clip-clop his way into Manhattan, where British headquarters were. But then he had to rely on somebody who lived in Manhattan to tell him info. So in the beginning, Robert was just his faithful friend. He was his informant initially. So Woodhull gets the information, then he goes back out to Setauket, writes it into a letter, and waits for Caleb Brewster, who's this brave whaleboat captain in Washington's army, to come across in the middle of the night in a little whaleboat with a crew of like 10 guys. They're going to avoid all the British warships, land in Setauket or nearby, meet with Woodhull, get the letters, get on the boat, go back to Fairfield. Now they're in Connecticut. Washington's not there, but Talmadge was there, our spy master. He'd read the letter, you know, get the important stuff out of it, make notes, you know, to give to Washington. The whole packet, along with like a lot of New York newspapers, would then get sent by express horsemen. These guys called dragoons would go across what's basically Boston Post Road, Route 1 in Connecticut, to try to find Washington along the Hudson or down in New Jersey, wherever he was at the time encamped, to quickly get him this message, but it wasn't very quick. I mean, that's a very roundabout way. So if this was how these Culper spies operated, why didn't they go the short way? Why didn't they just, from Manhattan, why didn't they just cross over the river and deliver the news that way? They never thought of that? Why do you think they didn't do that?
British were they?
That's right. The British were on to that idea. And every person who went the short way was stopped, completely checked. Every piece of paper was checked to make sure that you weren't smuggling a message. By going the wrong way, so far around, they were never caught. And they wrote hundreds of pages of letters to Washington. Most of them are still at the Library of Congress. And so Robert started out as an informant. He had a shop of goods, household goods, that his family had imported down in Lower Manhattan in a place called Hanover Square. And here's an ad from his shop. I kind of want to go shopping there. They're selling china, queensware, glassware, beer, hair powder, mustard, all kinds of good stuff. Candles and soap. He rented a room from the other spy in Setauket, Abraham Woodhull's sister. So this was the perfect ploy. Woodhull could come in on his horse. If he got stopped by the British, he could say, I'm visiting my sister, Mary Underhill. Okay, fine, you can go. And then at Mary's house, he could just knock on Robert's door and get all the information from him. So that was working great, you know, until it wasn't. So now spring has come in Oyster Bay. Simcoe and his Queen's Rangers pack up, 350 soldiers on horseback. They've got 3 big wagons in their company with equipment and stuff, and they're going to now go fight on the Hudson. They're going up to the Battle of Stony and Planks Point, right? That's where they're headed to. But as they're leaving Oyster Bay on May 18th, 1779, they're not leaving alone. Liss escaped with them. So Simcoe, who thought slavery was wrong, did he talk to her? Did he influence her? There was a new British law that had just about come out at this time saying that enslaved people who came over to the British side would get their freedom at the end of the war, right? So she leaves with the Queen's Rangers. Now I show her in a box. I don't know how she escaped with them, but I found a record of Simcoe buying a lot of nails from Samuel. Why was he buying all those nails? He also bought 2 big door hinges. So when we make the movie, or the Netflix series, or whatever we do, he is going to be making a hinged compartment for her, like in one of the wagons. Now we do actually know a lot about the escape from Robert, because he wrote to his father 8 days later and he mentioned her escape with Simcoe. He talks about his father's letter that he's answering that we don't have. So on my short list of documents I wish I could find, sure like to find that other letter that he was responding to. But at the bottom of page 1 he says, the Queen's Rangers, that's those regiment in the green uniforms, are now beyond Kingsbridge. If you can imagine Manhattan, the top of Manhattan, it was connected to the mainland by a bridge, King's Bridge. They had to pay a fee to get over, like a toll. So they've gone past that now. They've left Manhattan Island. And he says, if I see any of the officers, we'll make inquiry of Liss. Wait a minute, back up. How does Robert know where they are? And why does he think he's going to be talking to their officers anytime soon? He's way down in lower Manhattan, supposedly. But I think he was following them. I think he knew Liss was going to escape, and I think he was following them on horseback. But then he changes. He changes his idea with his father. First he says, if I see any of the officers, I'll ask about her. And then he says, though I think there is no probability of you getting her again, believe you should reckon her amongst your other dead losses, other things that are valuable the British have taken from you. Okay, which one is it, Robert? Do you know exactly where she is? Or will you never see her again? They never put a runaway ad in the paper for Liss. And I've scoured the papers of that era. There's many other runaway ads, but not for her. So there's something fishy going on there, is what I'm trying to say. Then he pins the blame on Simcoe at the end of the letter. He says, I'm surprised that Colonel Simcoe would permit her to go, because it was theft. He certainly must have known it when he left Oyster Bay. Well, he did know it. And in my research, I found 2 other instances of Simcoe helping enslaved black people escape during the war. One was a young man who ended up following him all the way to Canada and getting a soldier's pension from England. That guy's name was Barney. Trumpeter Barney when he was part of the regiment, and then Barney Griffiths when he got his freedom. And then a couple whose names I don't know, who escaped with the Queen's Rangers from Charleston. When they got up to Staten Island, Simcoe left the regiment just for a couple days to do something. When he came back, they had sold the couple into slavery for quick money. And he couldn't find them. He couldn't get them back. He was very upset about that. So yes, I think Simcoe did know all about it. Now, Liss escaped, right? She's free. No. The British were promising freedom at the end of the war, not in the middle. So they just re-enslaved her. She was re-enslaved in Manhattan by a British officer. And that guy's name I've never been able to find. It's pointedly not in the record. Robert never reveals his name. But there she is. Now she's enslaved in 1779 in Manhattan. Now, this is exactly when Robert became the head of the spy ring. He's not just an informant anymore. Now he's the lead spy, Culper Jr., which means at this time he had to create his own informant network that was his trusted people. And he also had some pretty neat tools that the spy ring had just begun using. It says in the spy letter, I have received your dictionary. That was actually a code that converted words into numbers. Our spy master Talmadge took a dictionary, found 700 words he thought were important, and assigned them each a number. That way they could write in numbers instead of words, and if the British captured the letter, they couldn't decipher it, because only the spies and Washington and Talmadge had the code dictionary. Then he also says, and we'll be glad to have the stain as soon as possible. Who wants a stain? He does. What do you think he meant when he said the stain? What?
Codes.
Not a code, something else spies use.
Like a special kind of ink.
Yes, invisible ink. Yes. Liss. Now, Andre already had two kinds of invisible ink. One was revealed with heat. You take the letter over to the fire and the words would appear. The other was made visible through acid, like lemon juice would make the words appear. We couldn't use those kinds because the British already knew about them, and every paper that they got was checked both those ways. So we needed our own, and luckily, John Jay's brother, Sir James Jay, was a chemist, and he came up with a new thing for the American side. Invisible ink in two parts. One chemical to write with that completely disappears, one chemical to make it reappear. So the disappearing was called the stain, and the appearing was called the counterpart. Only James Jay knew the recipe, and he never wrote it down. He wanted Congress to pay him for the recipe, and they wouldn't, so he never told them. So we still don't know. They would write between the lines of another letter that seemed to be unimportant. But see, Robert sold paper, so he came up with another scheme. He'd take a ream of paper, slip a sheet out of the middle, write a whole letter on it, slip it back in, and send it along in the whole pack. But he had to make some kind of a little mark so you could figure out which page had the invisible writing on it. Yep. Now, not long after that, Liss has entered the city, Robert's become Culver Jr., he's establishing his own network. The other spy does something you're not supposed to do. He's so excited, he mentions another spy in a letter. Never happened again, because it shouldn't have happened the first time. But like I say, he was excited to share with Washington that a lady had joined the group. He doesn't say lady, he uses the code number 355. Think by the assistance of a 355 of my acquaintance. The prior sentence is talking about New York, so somebody he met in New York, a new acquaintance who's a woman, shall be able to outwit them all. There's been a lot of discussion about who 355 was. We'll never know because we only have this one sentence, but I just want to put it out there. Liss would have had a great way to outwit them all because enslaved black women were walking in and out of British headquarters and they just weren't even being noticed. And she knew that head spy, John Andre, so well. So I think it's plausible to put her at the top of the list. Now, remember Robert said, forget about her, you'll never see her again, don't even put an ad in the paper for her. But I found him buying her things in the time when he was Culver Jr. the spy. So in the top record, he's buying her horehound tea, which is a medicinal tea for a cough. And in the bottom record, he's buying a thimble and thread for Liss. So he knew right where she was. Now, this is the time in the program where I ask if you know who Benedict Arnold is. Please. Everybody here, right? This is Goshen, for goodness sake. You gotta know who this guy is. All right, so remember, it was John Andre who was colluding with Benedict Arnold. And what were they going to give up? West Point Fort. Now, here's the Hudson. There's West Point up on the hill. What is that line going across?
Chain.
A great chain made by Peter Townsend, whose daughter married Solomon Townsend and brought him into the iron business. Yes, that Peter Townsend. Okay, so they start writing letters, give me information for money, and this turns into this deal to turn over West Point Fort. Now, Andre and Simcoe were buddies. And Andre wanted Simcoe to know about it, but he couldn't text him, right? They had to meet in person. Sir Henry Clinton, the British George Washington, the head of the British Army, he's out in the Hamptons, at East Hampton. He'll have a meeting there with Simcoe and Andre. And Andre will tell Simcoe about the plot so he can get the Queen's Rangers involved and they can all put a feather in their cap when it goes off so brilliantly. Now, they're at this home of the Gardner family having this secret meeting, and two enslaved black women are there. One is a woman who lives in the household all the time, maybe a woman named Zell, but the second black woman is only there for the day. Did she come with Andre from Manhattan, perhaps? Maybe. One woman, the one who always lives there, is passing through the room. Maybe she's bringing them refreshments or whatever. She hears them talking about an American fort that's going to be turned over to the British by an American general. And she tells the woman who's only there for the day. The who I really think is Liss. Liss then goes, or whoever she was, goes to the woman of the household, Mary Gardner. The Gardners were another family that were on the American side, but trapped living behind enemy lines. She tells Mary Gardner all about it, because Mary has a son in Washington's army who's a surgeon. She's already got a secret meeting lined up with this guy like that week. She could have easily passed this information and thwarted the whole plot. So why didn't she? It's just foolish talk. These black women weren't valued, they weren't heard, they weren't believed or appreciated. And Mary Gardner didn't pass on the news. Amazing, right? And so another reason why I think it's Liss is because the second woman is described as a waitress, meaning enslaved woman, or perhaps mistress to Colonel Simcoe. She probably rushed into his arms because they hadn't seen each other since the year before when he helped her escape. She didn't stay with him in the Queen's Ranger. She went into Manhattan. So this was all witnessed by this person who was a member of the Gardner family who wrote it down, his memory of it. And she was so familiar with Simcoe that he was like, well, maybe she's his mistress.
Yeah.
Now, that whole story of these heroic black women is completely forgotten from history because it was specifically whitewashed. Unbelievable, but true. See Sally Townsend, Patriot? That's Robert's little sister in Oyster Bay, Sally Townsend. This historian, Morton Pennypacker, in the 1930s, he found that account that I found. And he read it, he knew what it said, he knew what it meant, but he didn't want to tell the story of two heroic black women. He took this story and he just changed it. He said that it didn't happen between two black women in East Hampton. He said it happened at Raynham Hall Museum, the Townsend House in Oyster Bay, and that it was Sally who overheard the two men talking about Benedict Arnold, except they weren't there. They were on the Hamptons. But nobody checked his work, right? Nobody checked up on him. Outside of Raynham Hall, they have a historic marker there that they know is not true. They insist on keeping it outside their museum to this day, even though I've told them to take it down many times. And it purports this whitewashed legend of Sally. This is a book in the 4th grade that they teach in that town. Treason Stops at Oyster Bay. This is the book they should be teaching. Remember Liss? I'm working on it. I've got Syosset. That's the next town over. We'll get there. Anyway, back to the story. That was just a little side whitewashing tale. So, as you know, Andre did not succeed, right? He was caught in the woods. He had the plans to West Point stuffed down his boots. He was caught, found guilty of being a spy, and hanged to death, just like our Nathan Hale. But who got away? Benedict Arnold, right? He jumped on that ship, the Vulture, went right down to Manhattan, and became a British general. But he didn't have the prize that he had promised. He didn't deliver West Point Fort. So he wanted to deliver something else. How about rounding up a bunch of suspected American spies? He rounded up about 40 people, many of whom were working with Robert. And Robert was terrified that he was going to get caught too. So he went into hiding for about 3 months out on Long Island. And when he came back into the city, he moved from Hanover Square, where he had been, over to kind of where South Street Seaport is now, a place called Peck Slip. And he started his shop there. He lived in the apartment above. No more ads in the paper. He was just going to lay low because he was sure that Arnold was going to catch him. But, you know, this is where Peck Slip is now. They just established a nice park. And right about there, where that manhole cover is, I really want a statue of Liss, because she ended up living there too. And I'll get to that in a second. Gotta work on that. So after that, no more spy letters from Robert. He was so scared, he said, I will meet with Woodhull outside of town. I'll give him the news audibly, but I won't write anything else down. But you know what? They surrendered. The surrender of Yorktown was 1781. And even though the war went on for a couple more years, that was just paperwork. Everybody knew that the British had won. And so the British in 1782 in Manhattan started all leaving. They were selling off all their camp wear and stuff and getting themselves together and leaving town, including the man who enslaved Liss. So now Liss has to make a decision. The war has ended and the Americans have won, but what's she going to do? About to leave on the evacuation by the British, and she not willing to go with him. She had shown agency when she escaped from Oyster Bay, and now she shows agency again. She doesn't want to leave with the British. She's a New Yorker. She wants to stay in New York. But how's she going to do that? She applied to Robert to repurchase her. Interesting. Which he did. Also interesting, because Robert would soon join an anti-slavery group. Robert didn't own any enslaved people, and he didn't want to. So, Robert purchased Liss so she could stay in New York, and then he hired a white maid named Polly Banvard, an Irish girl, to do the housekeeping. Why is he spending all this time and attention on Liss? Well, that's his last, he writes his last spy letter. He says, I'm done being a spy. Liss was 3 months pregnant. Now, that's a good reason not to go to Nova Scotia, right? Where you don't know anybody, you don't have any resources, you don't have a roof over your head. And she gave birth to this little boy that she named Harry in February of 1783. Later, Robert writes in documents that Harry is mixed race. He calls him mulatto. Who's the father? The white father? We don't know. But I have a sneaking suspicion that it's Robert. It may not be. But you know, he did show a lot of care for her, and he also showed a lot of care for Harry in going forward. So now she has a little baby boy in that Peck Slip apartment. When the baby was 6 months old, they were approached by somebody who was friendly to both of them. This woman who had just lost her husband, Anne Sharwin. She knew them through a saddle shop that she and her husband had had on that other Hanover Square property. And so she came to Robert and said, hey, I like Liss, Liss likes me. Why don't I buy Liss and the baby? And they can come over to my household, I need extra help. What do you think? Robert was skeptical because he knew things could go wrong. So he made her promise that she wouldn't sell Liss and Harry to anyone else. And if she wanted to move away, she would tell him so that he could buy them both back. Because parents and children could get separated very easily. It was very hard to get them all back together again. This woman, Anne Sharwin, agreed. And Robert thought that that was a done deal. But it didn't work out that way. Because she remarried after just a year. And the man she married, Alexander Robertson, did something to Liss that upset Anne so much that after just 1 month, their marriage ended. And then, to get back at Anne, he did something terrible. He sold Liss south to Charleston, South Carolina. And he kept baby Harry, who was 2 years old, at Hanover Square in New York. And Robert didn't stop him from doing that because he didn't know anything about it. Now, I put this slide up here for kids who don't know how far away Charleston is, but 760 miles away, and Robert had no idea this had happened. And here's 2-year-old Harry. Where's his mom? Will he ever see her again? Who's going to take care of him? The captain of the ship that transported her was an interesting and scary individual named Captain Tinker. He was notorious for kidnapping free black people in New York City and taking them down to Charleston and selling them for profit, people who had become free. So Liss was cargo down in his ship, the Lucretia. But inside the hold, she may have been down there with kidnapped free black people. Captain Tinker kept doing this for years, and this anti-slavery movement in New York tried to fight back against what he was doing by putting ads in the paper like this one. Now riding in this harbor, Captain Tinker, and will probably sail for Charleston in a day or two. She has on board a considerable number of Negroes. Some of these distressed objects were seen wringing their hands and praying to their relentless proprietors that they might be permitted to remain in New York. but by these hardened people, their petitions were treated with disdain. It would be well for free Negroes to be upon their guard, lest they should meet with some kidnappers and share the fate many have heretofore done. It's signed Benevolus, which was Benjamin Franklin's pen name. Now, Liss is in the hold, as I said, of this ship, the Lucretia, and now she has gone to Charleston. Now, on the same day, this is another crazy coincidence of this research, the day that the Lucretia entered Charleston Harbor up in New York, it was the very first meeting of a new anti-slavery group called the New York Manumission Society. Robert would join the group on their second meeting. Who started this group? John Jay. His right-hand guy was Alexander Hamilton. As I say, Robert was also a member. And another spy named Hercules Mulligan. Hercules Mulligan, friend of Alexander Hamilton. I don't have time to stop the story, but next Tuesday I'm publishing a story about Mulligan's enslaved helper, a man named Cato. I'll talk more about that afterwards during Q&A. So now, Liss is entering Charleston Harbor, and these guys are having their meeting to end slavery. Who enslaved her in Charleston but another figure from history? A man who had been a key member of the Boston Massacre of 1770, which is why we got that famous painting on the Remember Liss book. Most people are looking at Crispus Attucks, this man of color who was killed at the Boston Massacre. But this man standing right next to him with the raised club, his name was Richard Palms, and he's the man who enslaved her in Charleston. Just coincidentally, he had been living in Charleston since the war. So now this violent man, who's actually known to history, and was part of John Adams' trial after the Boston Massacre, is enslaving Liss. 2 years went by before Robert figured out what had happened. He confronted Alexander Robertson and actually went into this house in Manhattan and stole 4-year-old Harry out of the house. Brought him to his parents' house in Oyster Bay. Robertson, during this interrogation, tells him all kinds of information, but it's been 2 years. Is he going to be able to find Liss down south and bring her back up? Well, he did know 2 men who he thought might help. 2 men who did business with the iron anchors with his brother Solomon, who he knew thought slavery was wrong. So he wrote to the first guy, Richard Lushington, who said, well, I'm a Quaker and I won't buy a person no matter what. There were other reasons why he said no. But that was a frustration. And then he wrote other letters to this man, Adam Gilchrist. Adam Gilchrist was a friend of the family as well as a business partner. And he said he would cheerfully do it. But there were issues. For one thing, the guy, Richard Palms, who had enslaved Liss, didn't have enough money to pay for her in full. He had a mortgage on her, and he was still making payments. So that had to be satisfied first. The other problem was that group that Robert had joined hadn't ended slavery in New York, but they had passed a law while she was down there that said no slave may cross over the state line into New York from another state. So while she was there, it became illegal for her to return. So, what do you think? They just gave up on her? That was the end? No. Robert had a ship called the Julia. That guy, Adam Gilchrist, had the Julia. Robert had another ship called the Maria. I think they just smuggled her back on one of their ships, right back into Oyster Bay on Long Island. So I think she was reunited with her son, who was living at his parents' house, who was 4. And now she was living in sort of a state of quasi-freedom. I believe I found her listed as Elizabeth, a black woman, in 1789 at the Baptist Church of Oyster Bay, right across from Samuel Townsend's name. And I also think I found her in the 1790 census as Free Elizabeth, working for wages, not enslaved, in a very fancy household called Fort Neck House, which was in a town that's now called Massapequa. When you read Espionage and Enslavement, you'll get my reasoning for why I think that Elizabeth is hers and the family that lived in that house. I think it's a compelling argument. In any case, she's living as a free person, but she doesn't have her proper paperwork. There's the hall at Fort Neck House looked like. Here's some photography of the house from the WPA era. It ended up burning down in the 50s. But how does she and her sister Hannah get their legal freedom when they have these two distinct households that own half of her? That turned out to be a real problem. So in 1790, both brothers died. Samuel's side was now controlled by Robert, and it seems like he got everyone on his side to release ownership of both Liss and Hannah. But now his uncle's family had 7 children. They all have inherited pieces of Liss and Hannah. 4 of them died when he died of this big virus that hit their household. But then there were 3. I actually found a document at Hofstra University archives, one of those 3 releasing her certain proportion or right to Liss, Hannah, and several other enslaved people, inherited her from her father. This really demonstrates that co-ownership that I was talking about. Finally, those last 2 heirs manumitted or legally freed Liss and Hannah on the same day, September 3rd, in 1803. Liss would have been about 40. So she initially escaped when she was 17 and finally got her legal freedom at about age 40. I found one more record of her in that same Baptist church as a free person in 1806. Later on, they put the word dead next to her name, but we don't know what date she died, so they added it at a later time after 1806. I found another record that proves she died before age 70, so another list was made when she would have been 70 and she's not in it. So she's older than 43, younger than 70. That's about as good as I have right now. The church is still in the town. It's used as an office, but she worshiped in that church. Now finally, slavery ended by law, but it wasn't until 1827 in New York. And so New York has had 201 years of legal slavery, and we haven't had that many yet of illegal slavery. We're coming up on that, but we haven't gotten there yet. And so there may have been other people just as interesting as Liss, but to find all of her documents and weave it together is a way that we can understand all of the other forgotten people. And that's why we established our nonprofit and why I'm here today. And thank you for hanging in there. I gave you an extra fulsome version of my talk. And I would love it if you had some questions to ask to me. Yes, what's your question?
Do you know whatever happened to Harry?
I do know a lot about Harry. So when Liss came back from Charleston, he was about 4. He was not old enough to become free. How old do you think a person had to be before they were eligible to become free?
21.
It was 21 initially. When Harry got to be 17 years old, the law changed, and it jumped to 28 for men and 25 for women. So he got a big extra length added on. And Robert didn't think that was fair. But Robert couldn't free him because he'd stolen him from that other guy. So he didn't have a free record of owning him. So what he did was, he wrote his name in that Bible to kind of give him a birth date. Then he sold him to a neighbor. And he made that neighbor agree, you're going to free him when he turns 24. And if you don't, you're going to owe me $1,000, which was a lot more money than $1,000 back then. So I can't see that man doing that in a record, but I also don't see Robert getting $1,000. So my hope is that he did free him at age 24. He would have been freed at age 28 in any case, but because Harry doesn't have a last name, and there are multiple men in that town who are black, who only have a first name and it's Harry, I haven't been able to find him. And I really don't think we should assume he would take the name Townsend. He might, but Gabriel, for instance, the one who was the wedding present, he took the last name Parker, as did his daughter Rachel. Amos took the last name Burling, so you can't really say. how a person would name themselves. But on our board of directors, we have an African-American man named Tony Townsend, an amazing man, who can trace his line back to the era of slavery in Oyster Bay. There's a large community of African-American Townsends who live in Oyster Bay or grew up there. Most of them have had to live elsewhere because Oyster Bay's gotten too expensive to live in. And the same is true of Tony. But the Townsends were a big family with a lot of households in the town. They all enslaved black people. So it's very hard to, get a direct line. But you know what? It's worth it to just recognize as much as we know. And that's a good thing to think of with Liss. There are things we don't know, but there's so much that we do know. It's more than any other woman from New York who was an enslaved black woman than anyone else from that time. So, think about Harriet Tubman being a figure of the Civil War era. Liss should be that figure for the Revolutionary War era, I think. Yeah.
A little confused about the ownership issue.
Yeah, it's confusing for sure.
Now, he couldn't sell, later on, just recently you were saying he couldn't sell or give them their freedom because she was owned by 3 family members.
You had to get buy-in from everyone. If anyone still owned a piece, they could stop the freedom.
I get that, but earlier he sold her to, was it Robertson?
Anne Sharwin, yeah, who became Anne Robertson. He did do that. See, that was like an interpersonal sale. There was a lot of sales of people going on one-to-one that may or may not have been noted anywhere else. They could have just been like, I'm going to give you this money and here she is. Once she was sold south and he bought her from the British officer, so he might have had a bill of sale from that. Then he could transfer ownership to Anne Sharwin. But once he brought her back from Charleston, that was illegal. That was when she became an illegal person in New York. That was why Robert later on couldn't free her. Harry, he stole out of Robertson's house illegally. That was why he didn't have a bill of sale for Harry. But I do find him writing Harry into that Bible record. I think he was trying to create a record of Harry so that he could sell him to that neighbor. It's very confusing, believe me, I understand the confusion. It's also interesting to know, that we think of an enslaved person being owned by one person. But you could see in Liss's story all these different sales, escapes, resales. It was complicated.
So were there a lot of legal documents explaining just, like a mortgage on more than one person?
I hear about references to these mortgages, like Palms down in Charleston. We know that he still owed 50 pounds sterling on her when they were trying to get her back. There was a law that came about in New York saying that a war debt could be paid off over a 3-year period. They were trying to get past the economic strain that the war had caused with debts. And so that guy Palms had a legal right to take 3 years to pay off Liss. But Adam Gilchrist got the job done. I'm not sure exactly how. There's not a record of how Gilchrist got her away from Palms. Honestly, he could have stolen her. He could have said, just get on the ship. They could have just whisked her away. I do know that Palms was in serious debt down there. That's why he couldn't, he needed cash. He was trying to leverage that and say, oh, well, I won't sell her to you at any price. But shortly after Liss left Charleston, another person he owed money to, a significant amount of money, waited till Palms left his house in Charleston and cleaned him out, took every one of his possessions. And then there was a court battle over that. And the court said Palms was in the wrong and that this guy was allowed to own all of his possessions. That's a great record because it tells me everything that was in Palms' house. So when the props guy for the movies wants to know how to decorate Palms' house, we have everything, the mirrors, how many beds he had, his chairs. Pretty neat record. Yes.
A number of people in Orange County that came to Orange County in the 1700s came from Long Island.
Yeah. Specifically this area, Locust Valley and Oyster Bay.
If your family, if you have 8 kids, they can't all get the farm, so they had to go somewhere. And Orange County was like where that was opened up.
It was the sister community to Oyster Bay, it really was.
And the names Townsend,
Mm-hmm.
Brewster, you mentioned,
Yeah.
these are all names that are in Orange County history.
Mhm. Yeah.
Many of them are still alive, in.
Yeah, and you see it so clearly in this family because Peter Townsend of the Sterling Forge, who created the Great Chain, he had married into a family that had already come over here. I'm trying to remember that name, I can't think of it. But that Hawkhurst, that family was already established here making iron. Peter came from Long Island, learned how to make iron, and then he stayed here and started his business. And then Samuel Townsend's oldest son, Solomon, came here during the war because he couldn't go home behind enemy lines. He married, they love to intermarry. He married his own cousin, got into the iron business over here, but the business connections and the family connections were very strong. Yeah.
It's a wonderful, wonderful story.
Oh, thank you.
An enormous amount of research. I'm from Chester, and I know Peter Townsend was in Chester. And was his father, I'm getting confused now with the names.
Mhm.
His father was Solomon? Or no?
Solomon was his son-in-law.
Oh, okay.
So Peter, they all named each other the same names to
Yeah,
get to the right generation. But the original Peter Townsend, who married the Hawkhurst, Mary Hawkhurst, who made the Great Chain, his daughter Anne married Solomon. They
Okay.
both have the last name Townsend, so it's not like a typical marriage.
But that
Yeah.
Peter, I'm
Yeah.
very interested in that
Yeah.
because I live in Chester. The house they were in was torn down in the 1990s. And I wish they had saved that. There's so much history there.
And then his house was called Augusta, and there's a plaque still in this area that talks about the Augusta Forge that he owned.
Augusta Furnace in Texas.
Yeah.
That house, so that house in Chester was called Augusta?
I believe they called that the house Augusta after the forge, which is also called Augusta.
And was Peter Townsend of Chester
Yeah.
a first cousin with Robert Townsend?
No, they were more distant cousins. He married his cousin, but not his first cousin. That's something.
I mean, two men. What was their relation?
The Peter was, I don't know what it's called, when your son-in-law has a brother. Robert the Spy was the brother to his son-in-law. Peter's
Oh,
son-in-law.
okay, so-
Robert Townsend was his brother.
That wasn't the direct connection.
No. But they were all, they were very interested in keeping their wealth in the family. And that's why they loved to intermarry so much. They didn't know that it was bad genetic business. It seemed like a good idea at the
Are there
time.
any Townsend descended from them in the area today?
In Oyster Bay, there's just one family in Oyster Bay Cove, and I don't know them well, but they are still there. But as to the Townsends in general, the white Townsends, there's a group called the Townsend Association of America, or the Townsend Society of America, because it's such a huge family group. And that's based in Oyster Bay still. Yeah. Yes.
Some of the stuff that you had at the beginning of the presentation about even showing us in Goshen, the slave.
Oh, yeah.
What kind of resources, or if I were to go to a historical society, what kind of documents were you looking at to get?
Well, just ask me, and I'll give you what I found. Anytime. I want to share my research with others. I am not the kind of historian that's trying to have a dragon hoard of secret documents. In fact, if you get this book today, this is the simpler telling of Liss's story. I put in here for students or just readers QR codes after each short chapter. So you can go to a website called Consider the Source that's run by the New York Archives and see the documents with transcriptions that I found for that particular chapter. But I have kept a lot of records of enslaved people that are connected to Goshen, especially through his forge business and through Jane and Gabriel, that household. They eventually went back to Oyster Bay, and then Gabriel became free in the 1790s. So he was working for pay in the fields in Oyster Bay alongside enslaved people who were not being paid. So how's that for an interesting work environment? Then Solomon, who now had the anchor shop in Manhattan, he recognized Gabriel as a skilled iron craftsman. So he hired him and gave him an annual salary of $50 and the right to have a room in the cellar of the anchor shop, which is just a few blocks from where we live in Manhattan. And he said you can bring Jane and the children from Oyster Bay, and you can all live in the cellar together. However, Jane and the children were all still enslaved. So Solomon had a house nearby. I'm thinking Gabriel gets up, goes to work in the anchor shop. Jane and the kids go over to the house and start working all day in the house.
Yeah.
But for them, to live privately must have been important to them. Granted, it was a cellar. It was probably pretty dank. But for them, I mean, it was an improvement. Finally, after he died in 1811, Jane got her freedom. But the children had to wait for them to age in to freedom. It was really a terrible system. And, you know, I never had thought before this about inter-family freedom. And that if the mother and father are free, it didn't mean the kids were. That's why a lot of parents, when they would become free, weren't free to leave an area. They had to wait for their children to become free, which could take decades. It's really quite sad. Yeah.
So post 1827
Yes.
in New York, slavery is illegal.
Yeah.
I've seen
Not perfectly.
census
yes.
reports where households list members
Right.
as servants.
And so this is what we should remember, that generational wealth that we're so used to, they didn't have. And so, oh great, you're free. Too bad you have no money, no salary, and no viable way to accumulate money. And so a lot of enslaved people continued living in the same household where they had been enslaved, in a sort of quasi-state of slavery, by the way, but not legally enslaved. So they would continue to do work, let's say cooking or childcare, that the family trusted them to do. Maybe they would get a wage at that point. But the wage might be a roof over your head, which you'd always had, you know? So it took a long time to get to the point where a person could live separately. Imagine what you would have to accumulate to afford your own domicile. But when you see a generational free black families, you see how they did benefit from that generation. The first slave freed anywhere on Long Island was a man who was named Awa. When he was enslaved, he got renamed Tom. And in 1685, he became free and called himself Tom Gall. He didn't leave Oyster Bay. He kept living there. He accumulated land. He had cattle. He had an orchard. He married a free woman named Mary, and together they had a born free daughter. They later bought the man she married and freed their own son-in-law. So now the Gall family of Oyster Bay, I could write another whole book just about them. Now the Galls are moving through time in Oyster Bay with generational wealth. They can buy things at Samuel Townsend's store. They buy gunpowder and gunshot. They are free people. They can own a gun. And they can own land, and they buy fine fabric, they buy goods, and they have property. But it took generations to build that up. So right after people became free, after the law changed, it took many generations before they could get a foothold, and they were competing with poor white people for jobs at the same time. Good question. Lot to think about. So if you're interested, you could get the more complicated version of